Hi, this is Ashish from developerhut.net and welcome to the third session of Into the Spring series, which is Spring Validation. So, in this session, we will be going to see how we can use a simple annotation to validate our incoming request. So, we will be going to create a very simple web project and we will use this annotation to validate the values of incoming object. So, let's get started. Okay, so let's get started with creating a very simple Spring project. So project will be of type Maven, language will be of course Java. We will be using the Spring Boot version 3.3.4. Any version will suffice, that won't be an issue. Let's create a group. I will say com.developer hut dot let's say into Spring, right, into the Spring. Artifact ID will be, I will say Spring hyphen validation hyphen demo. Okay, and I will just keep the package name bit shorter. I will say com.developer dot into the Spring. Packaging will be of type jar and Java version will be 17. Now here we will be creating very simple web project. So let's add the dependency accordingly. I will say web, Spring Web will be our first dependency. I will also add dev tools just for live reload, and for validation we will be definitely required a validation dependency, which is validation from IO. Okay, being validation with Hibernate validation. So let's see, our form.xml. You can see we have added start a validation, we have web dependencies, and we have a dev tools dependencies. So let's create the project. So I have imported the project, and now to understand the validation part, we have to create some very simple basic structure. So let's start creating that. So I will create a class. I will say user. I will put this class in a model package, and let's create some variable. Let's say private int ID. So user has an ID, then private int user has username, which is string. I will say username, then private string password, and user also have a name. So I will say private string name, right? Let's also add some more details. So I will say private int age. Then let's also add some flag. I will say private boolean active flag, or you can simply say status as well, active or inactive. Okay. The next is private string email, right? And lastly, I will say private date, which is of type java.util, and I will say birth date. Okay, so these are the variables. Now let's create the getter setter. So I will go on the getter setter. I will say select all, and I will say generate. Okay, let's also create a constructor. So it will be easy for us to create the object. I will go constructor using fields, and I will say save. So our constructor is ready. Now let's create a repository class where we are going to store all the user details, right? So I will simply go and I will say class, I will say user repository, right? And I will put this in repository package. Here we will be storing all our user information in a map. So I will say public, I will say static, and I will say map. Okay, so map, which is of type, let's say integer, right? Because ID is integer in our user field, right? So we will be going to find out the user on the basis of ID, which is of type int. And the next is, of course, value will be of type user. Okay, I will say user map is equal to, let's say, new hash map. Okay, so map is initialized. Now let's create a method. I will say public, I will say user, um, and then I will say save. This method will be going to save the user and it will return the saved user. So I will say user, it will be of course taking of type user, and here let's say um, we will create the ID. So what I'm trying to do over here is I will take these information and I will create the ID automatically. Okay, so let's make a provision for that. So what I will do is I will create one static variable again. I will say public, I will say static, I will say integer, and I will say user ID is equal to, let's say, 0, right? And what we'll do before we creating a user, we will simply take the user ID. So I will say user ID plus plus. I will increment a unique user ID and then I will assign it to it. So I will say user dot set ID, which will be of course user ID. Okay. Once user ID is created, we will put this user in a map. So I will say user map dot put, right? The user ID of course and the user object, right? And we'll simply return the user. I will say return user. Okay, so this is a method which will save the user. We will call it from somewhere else. And let's also create one more method. I will say public. I will say list of user. Of course, we want a list. So I will say find all. And this will only return. This will simply return all the users. Okay, so I will say return. I will say new array list of type user, of course. I will say user and I will say user map dot values. Okay, so this will simply convert all the values into array list and it will return back. Let's also create one more method to find out the user. So I will say public, I will say user, and let's say find by ID, right? And we'll simply take a ID as well here. I will say int ID and we'll simply return user map dot get. The object key will be of course ID. This will take integer. Map will take either primitive data type or object as well, so you can use both over here. Okay, now also add our annotation which is at the rate service, because I want this class to be treated as a service class. So let's add one default user in this map so that it will be easy for us to get that value and use that value for the next operation. So what I will do is I will say public void create user, and here we will say user is equal to new user, and we will add all the values. So let's go ahead and I will simply just update this. So what is this? First is ID, then username. Let's say David is the username, right? Then I will say password, which is password, right? And name, of course, David, right? Then age will be of type, let's say 45, or I will take younger one, which is 25, right? And active flag will be, of course, true, right? Then email, I will say David at the rate, let's say gmail.com, right? And birth date, so I will say new date, any date that will be okay for us for now, right? And we have user is created. Now let's add this user. I will say user repository add, so we say this dot save and we simply pass the user. Okay, so we have one user which is already there in our database. Now to call this method we require two annotation. One is configuration, right? The first annotation is the configuration and another is at the rate post. construct. Okay, so post construct method, this method will be called as soon as the application gets started. Okay, and this class is loaded at the application startup. So that's why we have a configuration. So we are all set for a user repository. Now let's proceed ahead to create the controller. So I will simply go here and I will say class which is user controller, which is of course in a controller package. Okay, now I will simply say this is of course a REST controller. Okay, and let's create a method. Very simple, two methods. First is public, which returns the list of users, right? I will say find all. Okay, and we'll simply use this. We need to import a user. We also need to auto wire our user repository. So I will say auto wire. I will say private user repository. We'll say user repository, right? And let's return this. So I will say return user repository dot find all. And this will return the object. Let's also create one more method to get the user. I will simply say find by ID, and it will also take ID. We'll take ID shortly. So first we'll go here and I will say find by ID. Okay, this will return the user, right? This is not going to return the list, so it will be only user, right? Now let's add the mapping. So I will simply say add the get mapping, and I will say value is, let's say, find all, right? Simply copy this as well, and here instead of say find, right, slash, I will say ID, right? And let's add this. So I will say add the rate path param, which is of ID, right? It should be in double quote, and I will say int ID. Okay, and we'll simply pass this ID to this method. So let's test this whether we are able to get this user or not. So I will simply start the project. So our project is started. Now let's go to the browser. I will say http localhost, and I will say find all. Okay, so we got all our users, the default user which we have stored earlier. Let's duplicate this and let's say find if it's working or not. So we'll say find one. Okay, so this is not working because this is a primitive. So let's update this. So I will say string instead, right? And I will simply parse this integer dot parse int, and let's run this again. Our project is started. Let's refresh this. Let's see if it works. Okay, so this should be path variable, not path param. So I will simply say path variable. So let's try this. So application started. Let's go ahead, refresh this. So we should get one user. So this is working till now. Now let's move ahead to our Spring validation section. So to proceed ahead for the validation part, I have added one more API, which is to save the user, which is of a post mapping. With this, will take the user as a request body, and we are calling the repository save method to save this user. This method will be returning the updated user object, which is saved into our database. So we will be using post one for this. Now, next is whenever we are saving this object, we want to perform certain kind of validation on this. Now, let's see how those validation we can add it in our application. So now to add the validation in this object, we need to add some of the annotations. So as a part of this session, we have added one dependencies, which is Spring Boot Starter validation. Now let's use the annotations from this dependency. The first is we need to add the annotation to that object where we want to perform the validation part. So let's say if you want to perform the validation on the username, right? So there is the first annotation. Let's say as a part of my validation, I want to perform the size limit validation, the size based validation, where I want to check whether the size is minimum of 5 character and maximum of a 10 character, right? So how we can achieve this? So you can simply add at the rate size annotation, right, which is from Jakarta validation constraint package, right? And let's add. So you can say minimum, okay, minimum we want 5 and maximum we want 10. So minimum size of username should be 5 and maximum it is up to 10, right? Now, once you add this annotation, you also need to tell framework that you have to validate this object. How we can do this? It's very simple. So on a controller layer where you are taking the user object, you just need to add one more annotation, which is at the rate valid. So I will say valid, which is again from Jakarta.validation package, and you just save this. Our application is restarted. Let's try to save the object without this specification. So I will just go to the Postman and I will say, so minimum it should be 5, right? I will send and I got an error, right? So it is a bad request, and if you go down, you can see all the details why this validation failed, right? So if you see here, the default message size must be between 5 to 10, right? So let's try to make it minimum 5. Let's say John D, and let's try to save this. Okay, now this object is accepted and stored into database, right? However, in earlier case, it is not accepted because there is a size limit we have added on that instance variable, which is a username. Now, if in case if this fails, right? So for example, let's say if I just added something, right, which is more than 10, right? And if you see here carefully, the default message is something which is provided by the Spring framework automatically. Now I don't want to provide this automatic message. Instead, what I want is my custom defined message. So in that case, we can simply add the default message in this annotation itself. So let's say you just need to add the message and provide your message. Let's say minimum 5 and maximum 10 cats or characters allowed, right? If you just save this and let's try to run this again. So if you see, the default message is changed now, which is what you are expecting, right? So minimum 5 and maximum 10 characters are allowed. Whatever the message that you want, those message is returned as a part of the error. Okay, now next is you can use the size annotation in a different way as well. So what I will do is for password, right? So I will add the size, right? And you can say minimum 8 character has to be there. I don't want to put any maximum limit, but I only want minimum limit has to be there for the password field, right? And let me add message as well. So message will be password should be minimum 8 characters, right? Let's save this, right? Let's see if it works. I will just correct this message. So now let's update the password field. I will simply make it less than 8, right? And try to send it. And we got an error. And if you see here, the field error field is the error field is password, right? And default messages, it should be minimum 8 characters. Okay, so now it is saved. Let's say if we have update the password with more characters, let's try to send this and it is still work, right? Because now we didn't added any restriction on maximum limit, right? So this is how the size validation work, right? Now there is one very interesting annotation which is the pattern, right? So in the pattern you can add the regular expression, okay, and that regular expression will be evaluated during the validation. So for a name, for example, let's say if you want to add some regular expression like name should be uh, between 3 to 9 characters and it should not contain any special characters. Also, you can achieve using the pattern annotation. So I will add at the rate pattern, right? Pattern, and if you see here, we have a regex. Okay, so you can add the regex here. So your regex should be like this, right? So it should be A to Z, right? And capital A to Z are allowed. 0 to 9 is also allowed, right? Now, what is the length that we are expecting? It should be minimum of 3 and maximum of 9, right? Okay. Now, I will just add a message as well. So I will say name must be 3 to 9 characters with no special characters. Okay. Or what I will say is instead of long with no special character. Let's save this. Let's try to test this, right? So I will go to the postman, and so let's make it 2 characters and let's try to send it, and we got the bad request. And if you see, the error field is name, of course, and our message is displayed, right? And you can add, let's say if you say John at the rate 123, right? It should not accept this, right? And we should get the default error message or error for this particular field. Now next is we can also add the validation for the number fields, right? So for example, age, I want only those user requests should come to my application whose age is minimum 15. Okay, so for that we have minimum annotation and you can simply pass 15, right? And you can also add like this will still work. Okay, however, if you want to provide message, you can also do that, right? So I will say value 15 comma, I will add the message as well here, right? And I will simply say age must be minimum of minimum 15 years. Okay, and let's save this. Now if I update this, I will just simply update this, and age is 10 here. Now let's see if it works or not. And we got the error message, yes, for field age, and we got a message. Okay, so similarly we also have an annotation max as well, which work on the maximum value. Okay, so minimum 15 and maximum, let's say 75. So this will also work. Okay, so it is up to you what kind of annotation that you want or what kind of validation that you want to perform, right? Now next is on the boolean value, right? So you can also set some boolean value type validation over here, right? So for that you can simply use assert true or false, right? So for example, I want only true value has to be there while request is coming to my application. So in that case, you can simply add assert true, right? In case of it is false, it will reject the values. So let's try to do this. I will say minimum age is 15. An active flag is false here. Now let's send this and let's see. So we have a error field which is active flag and it must be true. Okay, I didn't added the message. So in case if you didn't added any message, Spring Framework will by default provide its message. Right. Now next is there is one more very useful annotation which is at the rate email. Generally we take the email as the input and we have to perform lot of validation. Okay, so in that case we already have the email validation annotation which will do all this validation kind of stuff for us. Okay, so you just need to add the validation email and you can forget about all the validation part of that this field. Let's try to say, so I will just make this true, right? And I will first say a correct email. Let's see if it works. So yes, it's working. Now let's try to remove this. This should work because this is still a correct email format, right? So email should definitely contain at the rate, right? So if I remove the at the rate and let's say .com, right? So in that case, this should throw the exception. Okay. So if you see, we have error field which is email and with the default message, right? Now, next is the date related annotation, right? So for example, we have a birth date, right? So if you are taking birth date as input parameter, then you need to validate that birth date. It should not be less than a today, right? So for that, we have a two different annotations. The first is to perform before date validation. You can simply add at the rate past. Okay, so at the rate past annotation is there. So let's see, and this is the today's date. Let's see, and let's try to send this. This is work, right? Let's say if I mistakenly added the date in the next year, right, 2025, and let's try to send this. And if you see, we have an error with field which is per date, and it must be a past date. You can add, of course, you can add your default message, right? The same case for future date as well, right? So for example, let's say I will add one more field which is, let's say, private date as a meeting date. Okay, and I will add, say, at the rate future. Okay, and I will simply add the message as well. We'll say, let's say, invalid meeting date. This should be future date. Okay, so this is something that we want to validate. Okay, we forgot to add the getter setters here, right? So I will just simply add the getter setters. These are required, so make sure that they should be there, right? Otherwise it just won't work, right? Let's go here and start this. If you see here, we have error field which is meeting date, and you can find the error message as well. So these are the few annotations which I covered in this session. These are very heavily used in the day-to-day normal development process. If you want to perform any other kind of a validation, you can simply go to this link where you can find all the annotations which you can use it in your application. There are lot of few simple annotations which you can add it in your application. So I will also add this link in the description section as well. I will also add this link in a description section below. So I hope you understand how to use Spring annotations to perform validation on your incoming request. So all the source code which I have demonstrated in this video session is available on my GitHub repository, and you can find the link in the description section below. If you have any question, please add it in the comment section and I will try to provide the answers to those as early as possible. And if you think this information is valuable, please do like and share this video. Thanks for watching, and I will see you on the next one.